Greetings, my name is George Falconer and this is Peniel. I'm going to read a passage from the Old Testament from 1 Kings chapter 18 and from verse 16. The situation is that Elijah has been in exile. God has provided him by miraculous means, being fed by the ravens. Let's face it, birds don't feed us, do they? And he's been in a cave and God has provided water for him, and he's also provided a widow to feed him who hardly had a thing for herself. And now the point has come where Elijah has to return and confront the king about the false god Baal, and in so doing he's confronting the whole nation for their ungodliness. I would imagine that many of you are familiar with this passage, but I just want to draw a few thoughts from it. And Elijah has pledged to his servant, who he sent to the king, to say he's going to meet him that day. And the servant has to be sure that Elijah is going to do it, otherwise the king will put the servant to death. That's how bad the king was, how ungodly he was. Anyway, it says, so Obadiah went to meet Ahab. The servant has passed on the message, and Obadiah has gone out to meet with him. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Can you believe it? The king blames Elijah for the troubles of Israel, for the drought that had fallen upon them, for the famine that had fallen upon them. He blamed him, not himself, for his own ungodliness, for worshipping Baal and encouraging the whole nation to worship Baal and building altars to Baal. It was his fault, him and Jezebel. But he blamed someone else. It's easy for us to blame other people for the things that are our fault. I have not made trouble for Israel, Elijah replied, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So he's telling them to bring all the false prophets with him. This is a public announcement. The whole nation would get to find out about this. Every single one of these prophets are there. Hundreds of them. One Elijah. One true prophet of God against hundreds of false prophets. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." That reminds me of something that happened when I was 18 years old and I was in hospital. And I was in a cubicle with two older men in their early 70s. So I was 18, they were in their early 70s. And the conversation got round to about Jesus. And one said to the other man, Jesus Christ was either the biggest colossal liar who ever existed, or he told the simple truth. And the other man agreed with him and said, Jesus said, only believe. Now, I think that's what Elijah's saying here. He's saying you have a choice. Just like these men in the hospital saying, you've got a choice. You either believe Jesus or you don't. So they're saying, if Baal is God, follow him. But if the Lord is God, follow him. That is the stark choice. That is the question that Elijah was confronting the king and the whole nation with. Who is the true God? Whom do you follow? Whom do you trust in? And whichever one is the true God, that's the one you have to follow. And the people said nothing. It says, but the people said nothing. I'm sure they were dumbfounded and didn't know what to say. Because whatever they said, if they said, we'll go and follow the Lord, the king would have been very angry and set about them. And on the other hand, if they say Baal, well, they're wrong. So they said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let them choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. So suddenly all the people have said, this is good. We're going to follow whatever God provides fire. They've not answered the first question, but they've agreed with this. This is good. I think they were being diplomatic and trying to spare their own lives. I might be wrong about that, of course, but I do think that's what the case. They said, this is good, and whatever God answers by fire, that's the God we're going to follow. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given them and prepared it. I wonder if them seriously expected their God to answer. I'm sure they did, actually. At least some of them must have done. They thought, how difficult can it be for our God to rain fire to burn this wood and burn the sacrifice? Then they called the name of Baal from morning till noon. O Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. They become more fervent, crying out to Baal for hours. And when Baal doesn't answer, they start dancing around the altar, crying out to him all the more. I'm sure they were exhausted. Not one single spark fell. Now, having watched this until noon, Elijah begins to taunt them. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as this was their custom, until their blood flowed. So they're offering themselves like blood sacrifices. They're offering more and more to Baal. They're offering the wood and the sacrifice, then they offer the dancing, and then they offer their blood. There's nothing they didn't offer except their own lives. You'd have thought they would have learned by now, but they hadn't. Midday passed and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. So the time has come for the sacrifice, and there's not a single spark, and they've been at it all day. They must have thought we're in big trouble. Baal hasn't answered. Baal hasn't done as we asked. And we are challenged by this question. If Baal is God, if Baal is truly God, follow him. And if the Lord is God, follow him. And perhaps they were starting to realise their own lives were at risk, as we shall see later on. And Elijah taunting him said, perhaps he's deep in thought, or perhaps he's gone off on holiday, or perhaps he's travelling. Isn't he God? In other words, isn't your God false? He's non-existent. He's merely carved out of stone, and he's in your imagination. He's not real. He can't do anything. And even today we worship gods that can't do anything. Often they're gods of self or selfishness, or we worship creation in different ways. We are no better than them. We need to worship the real God. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. This is the evening at the point where the sacrifice has to be made. They came to him, and he prepared the altar of the Lord. He repaired the altar of the Lord, which was in ruins. Now that in itself was significant. I'm sure the altar they had built for Baal was Baal's altar, and this is the altar for the true God. So this is saying to people, I am worshipping a different God. You know this altar that's fallen into ruins was the altar at which Israel worshipped the Lord and burnt sacrifices to him, which was a looking forward to the ultimate sacrifice that Jesus Christ would make with his own life, his sacrifice for our sin. But by repairing that altar, and not just sticking it anywhere, he was saying, you watch this. This is the real God. I have repaired the altar that you have allowed to fall into disrepair. I worship the true God. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. Remember that incident when Jacob was left alone and was praying and was going to cross the river the next day, and suddenly someone attacked him. And Jacob must have had all sorts of thoughts of who was attacking him. Perhaps he thought it was his brother, because he was going to meet his brother, and he knew that 400 men were coming with him, and his brother hated him. And Jacob began to realize who he was wrestling with. He was wrestling with God, and he prevailed, and he called the name of the place Peniel, for he had seen God face to face and survived. That's what Peniel means, the face of God. And this passage reminds us about that. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 sets of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." Now bear in mind, there's a drought. Water was valuable, it was precious. He's saying, pour the water all over the sacrifice. I want there to be no doubt about it that I've not sneaked in some flint or a match and set this alight myself. There's going to be no conspiracy theories about how I lit this. We're going to pour water over it again and again so that it's absolutely soaked and there's no chance of it manually going on fire. You will know that when this goes on fire, God did it, not me. Do it again, he said, and he did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered, and he did it the 3rd time. The water ran down round the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you're turning their hearts back again." That's what God was doing. He was searching the hearts of the people and turning them back to himself. And they would know Elijah was a servant of God, and what Elijah was doing was not being like a magician. He wasn't doing this of his own accord, he was doing it according to God's command. And we need to do things according to what God has revealed, in obedience to God. And Elijah was doing that. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" They must have been terrified. Elijah hadn't been crying out for hours and hours and hours like the false prophets of Baal, and he certainly hadn't done any dancing round the altar, and he hadn't slashed himself like they did. God answered in response to Elijah's prayer, and God answered in response to his own promises that he gave to Elijah. And so the fire fell. Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. Now that might seem terrible, but they had been the leaders encouraging people to worship a false god. And as long as they were around, there might be the temptation to return to a false god. So they were punished for this sin by being put to death, and also the possibility of the people being double-minded about it. That was taken care of, but then put to death. And the whole nation would have known the prophets of Baal have been put to death. The true God has seen to that. Everybody would have been talking about it. The equivalent today would be like going on social media and being on the national news, and everybody gets to see it on television and on their laptops and their tablets and their telephones. Everybody would know about this and say, "Look at what God has done. We need to get our hearts right with God." And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." Now that would have seemed absurd. They had had years of drought. The land was parched. Not one single drop of rain had fallen. But earlier on in this chapter, God had promised Elijah he would send rain. So Elijah's not just making this up. This is not wishful thinking on Elijah's part. God had promised it. Elijah believed God, even although the place was parched. It was bone dry. So Ahab went off to eat and drink, but Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. "Go and look toward the sea," he told his servant. And he went up and looked. If you're reading this story for the very first time and don't know what it is, it's easy to think, oh, the servant's going to go up there, God has promised this, and he's going to see the cloud coming immediately. No. The servant returns and says, "There is nothing there," he said. 7 times Elijah said, "Go back." I wonder what went through Elijah's mind and through the mind of the servant as each time he went back 7 times. And I think there must have been a period of time between each time Elijah sent the servant. Would we be discouraged each time we went to look for rain and come back with the message, "There's nothing there"? Has Elijah heard God properly? Is God going to carry out his promise? It's easy to think like that. God had promised, but didn't carry out his promise immediately, and certainly didn't carry it out in the fashion that we may think he should. He didn't just do it just like that. He's working on the character of Elijah's persistence, because I think in prayer Elijah was probably praying to God and reminding God about his promise and pleading with God to send rain, and the servant, I'm guessing, was learning from this as well. The 7th time the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." Just a tiny cloud. Not an enormous one that immediately blacked out the sky. Just a tiny cloud. About the size of a man's hand. It was about this size. And Elijah knew God was granting his promise. I wonder what went through the mind of that servant. Because, I see something, it's a tiny cloud. And you could be forgiven for thinking a tiny cloud is not going to make much difference, is it? But Elijah knew God was moving. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. So Elijah said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." See, Elijah had the promise from God that God was going to send rain. So he knew this little cloud was the start of it, and he should tell Ahab to get moving now, to go home, because otherwise the rain's going to stop you reaching home. That's the magnitude of what's about to happen, and this cloud has appeared. Even though it's a tiny cloud, it's just the first sign of what's coming. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, and the wind rose, and a heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. He outran the chariot. He was an Eric Liddell of his day. He outran the king's chariot. God carried out his promise. God drew the nation back to himself, or at least he was in the process of doing so, because remember, Ahab is still in place as king, an ungodly man who had misled the nation, he and his wife. And yet God is still sovereign. God carries out his promises. And we can search the scriptures and find the promises that God has made to us, and find that God carries out those promises. That God carries out his promises in his own time and in his own way. It's not up to us to dictate to God how he carries out his promises. He is always working on us, working on our character, shaping us, calling us to himself. And we need to respond, just as I'm sure the people responded when they saw the fire fall, and they said, "The Lord, he is God. He is God." The Lord is still God. And I leave you with that thought. Amen.